Jerome Deroy, welcome to Mindworks in Conversation. You're the CEO of Narativ, and I wanted to ask you about your personal origin story. Narativ was founded on the idea that everyone has a story to tell, and just really interested in what first drew you to the power of storytelling, and how did you come to see listening as a crucial first step?
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for having me and being part of this conversation. Well, yeah. So to answer your question about the origins, so for me, I mean, you're absolutely right. Listening is a key kind of component of how I see effective storytelling happen. Because if nobody's listening, your story is not going to have any impact. It's kind of as simple as that, but it's also pretty subtle and nuanced. But for me personally, I went to business school and I started a career in finance in my 20s, basically, and that took me to various places. First in Paris, France, and then Hong Kong and Asia. So it was a very fulfilling kind of start to my career in the sense that it was scratching the itch that I had of discovering different cultures, and finding out about different people and how they thought, etc. On the other hand, what it didn't really scratch was my sort of creative itch, and about, I would say, about 4 years into this job that I had in finance, I walked into my boss's office about 6 months after I had put into my search engine three different keywords. One was film, the other one was business, and the other one was New York City. And at that time, I was in Hong Kong. And so 6 months after doing that and seeing the results, I walked into my boss's office and I told him I quit. And he asked me what I was going to do. And I said, I'm not sure, but I know it's going to be creative and meaningful. And so then I got to New York City, and I was very fortunate to meet pretty quickly the founder of the company that I now run, called Narativ. His name is Murray Nossel. And he's the one who really introduced me to some of the principles of listening and storytelling that I embrace today and still work with people on today. And what inspired me about what he told me was that he had kind of conceived of a particular methodology in listening and storytelling based on his experience of working with people with HIV and AIDS in the mid 1990s or early 1990s, when the treatments that exist today didn't exist. And he found that his training as a clinical psychologist, as a social worker, wasn't really working to support them in the way that they wanted to be supported. So, in other words, he would ask questions like one on one. It would always happen one on one. How do you feel? And asking about their feelings and thoughts and all of that. And they said, well, inevitably, how would you feel if you knew you were going to die in a week? This was a pretty dire situation, and so eventually, what he found out in the course of being in this program that specifically supported people with HIV and a diagnosis of AIDS, was that they were really not afraid of dying, but the thing that they had sort of accepted that, but the thing that was really their number one fear was actually that they wouldn't be remembered, that they wouldn't have anything to leave behind. And that's when Murray told him, well, why don't you just tell me your story? And I promise I won't ask you any questions about your feelings or thoughts, but the only thing I'll do is listen to you openly and non-judgmentally. And all you'll have to do is just tell me what happened. And that'll be your story. And instead of just telling it to me, tell it to the whole group so that your stories will be carried into the future, and it will be the listener's responsibility to have you remembered, essentially. And that's how you'll be remembered. That's what you'll be able to leave behind. It was very effective, and people really loved the program, and they told their stories. They made videos of their stories. And then they even used their stories as advocacy tools. They took their videos and left them on the desks of legislators and told them and advocated for better treatments and care. And it really went a long way to changing even people's mindsets around, at the time, the virus. So based on that, a company was born. And then, when I met Murray 10 years after that, I was inspired by that story I just told you. And I saw a connection for me in where I came from in the business world. And that was that I wasn't alone in quitting my job to try to find something more meaningful and creative. Even for those who weren't that creative or who weren't particularly interested in meaning, there were still lots of people leaving that company every 3 or 5 months. Um, and my boss kind of, threw his hands up and just said, well, maybe it's because others pay better and, I can't really pay them more than I already do. And I discovered in hindsight that really they weren't engaged at work. And then I found out that engagement or disengagement is a real plague in corporate America and indeed worldwide. And I saw this method of storytelling as something that could really engage people. First, by me owning my story, I'm engaging myself, and then I've got now this tool to engage other people. So that was really how it all started, and what it's kind of evolved into.
Yeah, in the model of listening and storytelling, the listening part I thought was really interesting that the first thing that's required is before you listen to others is to listen to yourself. Do I have that right?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. Because a lot of times, it's quite simple when you think about it. Of well, of course, I should tell a story in order to introduce myself, to sell my product, my service, or to advocate for better care, right? That sort of thing, or to articulate my vision. Of course, we know that storytelling works. It's a very effective communication tool. But what we discovered is that the thing that gets in the way of our ability to tell our own personal story, I'm not talking about fictional or metaphors, etc. But when it comes to me telling a personal story, I'm not alone in thinking that it's quite an intimidating proposal. And for a lot of people, it's even threatening because it feels very vulnerable, and it kind of makes us feel like I'm just setting myself up. It's kind of a risk, and what if I don't do well, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this inner voice that just keeps on talking to us and telling us all the reasons why we shouldn't do it. And that's really how we listen to ourselves quite a bit, not just with storytelling, but with a lot of things. We're usually our number one critic. And so that's where we became interested in understanding, well, if we're going to teach people how to tell a story, we'd better teach them how to kind of clear their listening slate. And that's what we mean by listening to yourself. So that all those judgments, all those kind of criticisms, all those opinions, interpretations, etc., that we have kind of on a running, it's like a running monologue that's going on in our heads. It's what we first try to do is to get people to understand those and identify them, because once you're able to sort of name what that is, then you're aware of it, and then you're better able to maybe create a strategy to address it. And in our methodology, it's not so much about, well, you should go and go to your therapist or find a therapist and deal with those obstacles and then come back to us. Rather, it's in the moment, what's currently preventing me from listening to myself and others in such a way that is open and non-judgmental. And then you identify those obstacles, and then you just come up with simple strategies, even if it's just, I'm just going to try for 5 minutes to set this aside and see what happens. Does a new thought come up? Does a new idea come up? What happens when I listen to people in this way for just 5 minutes? Is something that's coming out of their mouth surprising me? Is there am I more curious? Am I more able to discover something? So that's real why we start there, and that's what we mean by listening to yourself.
Yeah, so much of what you said reminds me of the artist's dilemma, you know, like
Mm.
what prevents people from becoming artists or doing more in that regard because their inner dialogue might say to them, this isn't worth it, nobody's interested, and all that business. And rather than just, this is me, this is how I see the world, this is how I'm representing it, and so forth. So I really could relate to that part of listening to one's inner dialogue as a
Yeah,
starting point and trusting. I think trusting also the group that they will accept who you are if you have a story.
that's exactly right. And I'm glad you mentioned this word group because our 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 training programs and workshops happen necessarily in group settings because when you do the exercise of looking at your own obstacles to listening, and you start to share that in a group setting, you realize that everyone around you has, if not the same obstacles, very similar ones. And if not on that day, maybe you don't have that particular obstacle on that day, but you're always able to recognize in someone else, oh, yeah, I do that too. And so then it creates this kind of bond within the group. And because people are sharing these kinds of things, it also creates trust. And then people are better able to look at, okay, now let's look at the storytelling piece. Let's look at what my story is. And again, in a group setting, it's a similar idea, right? You hear someone else's story, that triggers something for you in your own experience, and you think, oh, that could be maybe that's part of my story too. So you start to make all these connections. So the group dynamic is really important.
Yeah, that's really key because I think once people start to admit to their own personal sense of vulnerability, that's really that's a shared experience that we all have, but we try to, for whatever reason, keep that hidden.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I'm not sure if it's more of a problem with men or women or what, whether it goes along gender lines, but I think it's something that we probably all experience. I'm just wondering how do these stories then get used in organizational development? You're doing this as a group. How does it work
Yeah.
to improve the engagement? As you were saying, that one of the problems in corporations is engagement. How
Yeah.
does this method work?
Yeah, absolutely. That's been sort of my mission, certainly since I've discovered this method, is to try and move that needle in terms of engagement. And maybe it's important to also just say what we mean particularly with engagement. What I was noticing in the corporate world and still notice today to some extent, and one of the reasons we work in corporations is that increasingly there have been the numbers in terms of disengagement at work have been going up, uh, and there's a variety of different factors that go into that. But what we sort of felt where we could maybe make an impact is in helping people tell stories that are sort of infectious, and kind of bring to life the values that an organization is embodying or has chosen to kind of espouse. And we've all seen this, right? It's like, the things that certain organizations will say that they believe in or that they stand for. Even their websites might even have a whole section on, our values and that kind of thing. And the interesting thing about that, what we found is at the heart of disengagement is that a lot of companies have not been able to bridge the gap between who they say they are and what they do, the kinds of behaviors they have, or how they actually bring to life these values in an organizational setting. Many times these values are just a sentence on a website or a fancy branding deck, and there it is in a drawer or on a wall in an organization, but it doesn't really go much farther than that. And so we felt like, well, what if we could actually get people within these organizations to tell stories about times when they have seen these values in action or
Mm.
when they have seen these values being challenged, and what did they do in response to that? So in other words, what do I do when someone is actually not following my values? What if a customer doesn't connect with our values? What happens then? And so we've worked with companies in this way, and what it means is that we actually go into an organization, we do interviews much like this, but often in group settings, and we'll do a workshop. where we look specifically, and this is important because we start the same way with listening and what I explained, but then we look for specific stories and we ask people, we have the values with us, and we'll bring those around and we'll ask people to actually choose one or two of those values that really speak to them authentically, where they have experiences where they've actually seen this in their own lives, whether it's at work or not, by the way. And then we kind of help them excavate those experiences, and then that's where we apply our method in terms of the steps to build their story around that value. And what you end up with is a group of people who now have a story not just about their organization, but really about the values that this organization represents in the world. So that when somebody asks you, well, what does your organization believe in? What do you believe in as a person in this organization? You have a story now. You don't just have like, well, we believe that listening is really important, right? That's one of our values. Okay, well, I'm sure a lot of others can say that, but how do you live that? And so if you've got a story that can prove that, then it's very powerful. And the reason it helps with engagement is that when you engage people that are currently in the organization, you're telling them, and we usually do this, by the way, with people with a diversity of people in the organization. So very junior people to very senior people, and everything in between. We really try to get a good representation in terms of roles and seniority in particular. And what it does is that it tells people your voice matters, and you are part of this organization. We are a culture here, and it really important. It's important to us to not just listen to the CEO stories or the leadership stories, but everyone's stories. And then we kind of look at strategically, okay, well, now let's share these stories within the organization to encourage other people to reflect on what their stories are about the values of the organization. So it kind of encourages everyone to start to think about this and not just take these values for granted. And that's where we've seen some improvement in engagement. Yeah.
The last business I worked with in every office was our mission statement.
Mm.
And I looked at it and I thought, well, I agree with some of this, but I'm not sure exactly how I see this being enacted. So, and so I wonder what would have happened if we had had a discussion about how true we were to the mission versus how true we weren't. And it was a really good corporation, I should say. Um, so I'm wondering, in your experience as a narrative consultant, if I could call you that, I mean, you have a
Mhm.
really particular way of dealing with organizational issues. Do you find that after these discussions, these stories that you hear from people, that the mission gets changed or the values get refined over the course of time based on what people are saying?
Absolutely, absolutely. Almost, I mean, not in any drastic way, but the refinement that's what usually happens. And sometimes, there are even we sometimes go into organizations that have very sort of a loose set of values, and so you'll ask different leaders in the organization, and they'll kind of give you different responses actually about what those are. So sometimes it helps to just catalyze, crystallize. What are we really about? And it gives a kind of a mirror to these leaders who then say, well, actually, this is what your employees are saying. These are the stories that came up, and you told me the other day, that this is your story. There seems to be a little bit of a disconnect here and a gap. So maybe there does need to be actually a refresh of these values. But most of the time, it's a refinement. And the other thing that I'll say is that to the point you were making about the mission statement being in the office, and am I really relating to this? Am I not quite sure how this gets enacted? What we've chosen kind of a particular part of the employee cycle where there's been a lot of impact, and that's for new hires. So when you start a new job, you're excited usually. I mean, you're getting there, and you're quite fresh, and you really want to learn, and you're very curious about what this new culture is, this new organization you're in, and you want to do your job well. So you want to know all the tools that you're going to need, and the skills that you're going to need to sharpen in order to do your job well. And a lot of times that really depends on, what other people in the organization tell you, whether there's a formal mentorship program or not. But it's very often what people who've been there and done that, the more you can hear from them, the better. And usually that accelerates that learning curve that you've got. And so what we've done is quite intentionally look at stories of employees who've been in the organization for a little while that speak directly to what new hires want to learn about. And mission and vision is a really big one. Culture and values, that's another one we've talked about. But role clarity is really big as well. So we try to kind of describe experiences and turn those into stories that can be then shared with these new hires in the first month that they're there. And then they get to meet these people in real life, whose stories they heard, and get to have a discussion with them and say, well, I have a few more questions based on the story you told in this program. So that's a really big piece as well, is like, how do we strategically share these stories now that we've got them? Because at first, when I first started, we were having lots of kind of breakthrough, ideas come up within the confines of our workshop, but we didn't really have a way of actually sharing. It wasn't part of our deal with the organization to look at how we're going to share these stories. So very often these stories would kind of stay, within the workshop. And so very quickly we decided, we've got to kind of address that and discuss with our clients. Let's see it through. How are you now going to share these stories? Which stories are you going to share? For what purpose? And what is it going to impact? How can we actually measure the impact of these stories?
And how do you measure the impact? What are some of the metrics that you might use to see whether or not this is really working?
Yeah, it's very similar to how you might measure the metrics on a social media channel. How many followers are you gaining? How many people are responding? How many people are liking? So many of these organizations that we work with, they have some kind of an internal channel. And sometimes, it's just that they've made a YouTube channel private or something like that. Or they even have learning management systems, and platforms that they use internally. And so we look at the numbers, and what we try to do is the stories that get shared. We look at, how many people in theory should they reach within the organization. And there'll be usually an email campaign and something like that to click on the link. And so that's the first thing we look at. Very, just kind of the raw numbers of how many people are even watching this video, listening to this video, how many, and then we go into something a little bit more qualitative afterwards, once we've gotten those numbers. We also then go to the people who were the ones who told the stories that were shared, and because we have this built-in process of having discussions with them and getting people that listen to the stories to have a discussion with the people who told stories. And so then we go back to them and we sort of interview them and see what was the impact on those that you told a story to? What kinds of questions did you get? How many questions did you get? That sort of thing. So we look at both sides, quantitative and qualitative, and then we have a survey that we go and ask people who've listened to these stories, asking them particularly, what kinds of actions did these stories engage them in? Like, what did they do as a result of listening to this story or watching this story? And that's something that varies according to every organization. But, for example, we're able to sort of see, okay, well, I had one client who was a new hire, went through, or one person, I should say, that was part of a client organization. And this new hire went through this program and listened to these stories, had discussions. And then about 6 months later was in the field doing her job. And something happened, which was a real kind of challenge. She was, coming across someone that was kind of questioning everything she was doing. And she remembered in that moment that she had heard a story from her boss because of the program that we did for onboarding, who had a very similar situation. And in the story she told, her boss actually talked about her failure, right? That she couldn't get through to this person. But then she also talked about what she had learned from that interaction and how in the next interaction, she changed things. And so this person in the field, instead of having to go back to her office and say, damn it, I failed Now I need to learn from this and I need to do things differently. In the moment, she was able to apply something that she had heard in that story from her boss 6 months before and applied it in the moment and was able to get through that difficult conversation and that challenge. And so to me, that represents a real success and kind of the value of stories to begin with, because the fact that she even remembered that 6 months later kind of shows that we remember stories more than anything else. And then the other thing is that her own boss was willing to talk about, a story of quote unquote failure. But the reason she was willing to do that was because she had learned from it and she was able to apply lessons to further situations that she was in, right? And so I think when new hires in particular hear these kinds of stories where their bosses are, vulnerable and talk about challenges and talk about, when they face planted, and what they learned from it, that creates a lot of trust. And that creates a culture that kind of tells you, okay, so this is a culture in which I can try things out and I'm not going to get fired if I fail. But actually I'm going to be supported and someone's going to kind of show me the ropes a little bit, or there'll be someone there for me to support me.
Yeah, and that really speaks again to the power of admitting to vulnerability
Mm,
and learning from it. I've always thought that failure is, I'm not the only one that has thought this, obviously. Failure is a great teacher.
yeah,
How do you learn from it?
yeah,
But you're saying that it needs to be shared, and not just the feelings about it, but the actual facts.
yeah,
What did I do that created this problem?
yeah.
And that gets into the tell part. I think it's called the what's happening camera.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, that's,
Facts versus feelings. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Because the more, yes, so in our method of storytelling, we often we tell people to just say what happened to you, and that really did come from that program, during the HIV and AIDS kind of
Hmm.
public health crisis. But that program that Murray put together, what he realized is that many of the stories people were telling were filled with judgments and opinions and interpretations and very little kind of experiential facts, of their lives. Like, how did things happen? What did people say to you? What did you say to them in response? And instead, there was a lot of description of internal things, whether it was thoughts or feelings in particular. So it was very hard to discern what the story actually was. So he came up with this idea of like, well, just tell me what happened. Instead of telling me what you thought about what happened, what you felt about what happened, what your opinions were about what happened, judgments, et cetera, et cetera. Excise all of that from the story. And what you're left with is just a series of things that I would be able to see and hear if I was following you around with a camera. But this camera is particularly clever because it also has the three other senses. It can taste, it can touch, and it can smell, right? So that's what we encourage people to do in our workshops, is to find the moments of your experience as opposed to the conclusions that you came up with, the lessons actually that you came up with, the moral of the story. That's not the story, that's the moral of the story. And so when it gets to this story, we really encourage people to go into, what happened, when, where, who were you with, and how did this come up, and that sort of thing. And it's deceptively simple. It's kind of the screenwriter's creed of show don't tell, essentially. So you kind of see this in movies, but when you're talking about your own life, it's a hard thing to do because you've come up with very, very clever conclusions and very clever lessons that have gotten you to where you are. And so when you're asked to take that out, people
Hmm.
get quite reactive with that. Well, what do you mean my feelings, my thoughts? Of course they're important. And that's not what we're saying. We're not saying they're not valid or not important. We're just saying they're not the story. And once you're able to do that and to just tell the story as it happened, then you start to get why you do that. Because once you tell a story like that, especially in a group setting, you start to hear back from the group how they felt, what they thought, what their judgments were, et cetera, as you were telling the story because they were so engaged by it. And you start to hear, as the storyteller, you're hearing back exactly how you felt at the time, so that it's not necessary for you to do that, to explicitly say, this is how I felt, this is what I was thinking, because your audience gets it. They get it when you just tell them what happened, when you just show them what your life was like at a particular moment in time. You can trust that your audience is able to connect the dots, and they're actually better able to engage with your story and to feel their own feelings and have their own thoughts. It's so much more satisfying when I'm able to come up with something based on the story you're telling me without you having to kind of spoon feed me how I'm supposed to feel or think. That kind of creates a reaction in listeners, right? We don't like that. We don't like to be told how to feel or think.
Yeah, but I've always disliked that in a film
Yeah,
where suddenly there's a soundtrack which
yes,
signals how you're supposed to feel about something.
exactly. Yeah, the big
It
violin
deprives
and
me of my own imagination here. Let me just fill in the blanks. And so in this process, there's a storyteller and then there's a group that resonate to that story. Is it
absolutely.
almost like a
Yeah,
great
that
chorus
really
who then, yeah,
yeah, that relationship between the listener and the storyteller is really important for us to sort of kind of bring to life in the moment, because we really want people to get a sense of that, to get a sense that your listener is actually feeding you, and the way that they are listening to you is shaping how you're telling your story.
yeah,
And similarly, conversely, the way that you're telling your story is shaping how they're listening to you. So
yeah.
we're this constant kind of back and forth with one another. And so that's why we even came up with the term dedicated listeners in our workshops. We'll specifically ask for 3 people in the group to be dedicated listeners for the one storyteller, even if we have 15 people. So everybody has to listen, obviously. But then we ask 3 dedicated listeners to be that, to embody dedicated listening, whatever that means to you. And then afterwards, what that means is that we'll go back to those 3 dedicated listeners and we'll ask them, so what did you get from this? What values did you hear? What was the most impactful part of the story? What was most inspiring? What qualities did you notice in the storyteller? All of those things, that's where that comes up. What were you feeling as you were going through this story? What were your thoughts? And that's when the storyteller gets that gift, essentially, of that kind of feedback. So we never ask for any kind of evaluative or even, I mean, people love this term constructive criticism. None of that happens in our workshops, actually. It's really much more about, are you connecting with your listeners or not? And we get that sense by asking those dedicated listeners those very specific questions around what are they feeling, but also what values are they hearing, and depending on the point of the stories and what we're trying to get out of it in terms of the kinds of stories, we'll also ask more specific questions.
What qualifies people to be dedicated listeners?
I'll have to tell you, if they're in the group, anyone can be. And what we try to do is to have everyone tell a story, and also everyone at some point be a dedicated listener. So the moment you walk into our group, you are a dedicated listener, essentially. And really, what that means is that you're kind of bringing your whole listening, and you are, by saying to someone else, I am your dedicated listener, you are committing to setting aside whatever is getting in your way of being able to listen to this person, of being able to be 100% present. And so that's what we ask people to do, is we ask, if you're going to be a dedicated listener, which you all will be today, um, you are committing to, for the next, whenever you are a dedicated listener, that's why they're not always dedicated listeners for the whole thing. We ask them at a very specific point when people are starting to tell stories, and those stories are usually not more than 4 or 5 minutes long. And so we're asking them, for this amount of time, no obstacles to listening, or as soon as you notice any obstacles, you are committing to setting those aside so that you're bringing 100% of your listening. And if for some reason something is so egregiously getting in your way, to actually speak up and to say that, to say, you know what, I'm so sorry, but there's this obstacle that I need to take care of right now in order to then come back and be present. And that's okay. We've had that in our groups. We encourage people, We've had people leave for about an hour because they just couldn't get this thing out of their head. They had to, it was a meeting or something, and or an emergency, and then they come back after an hour and they're clear, they're good to go. We'd rather do that and have people actually leave the group than not being able to commit to setting aside whatever's going on, and just we need people to be able to listen during that time.
I just had a couple more questions. I guess
Yeah,
one was about the duration of these group meetings. Is this an ongoing process, or does it happen periodically? How does that work in terms of, and I'm sure each corporation is different in terms of what they're willing to do, what they can do.
sure. Yeah, it's changed over time as well, as we've noticed sort of better practices. But originally, this whole methodology was kind of created to be done in a 1 day workshop, sort of
Mhm.
intensive workshop for 12 to 15 people. And really, by the end of that day, you would have gone through all of the steps, and you would have your story, right? Then that we've sort of created different formats, but in theory, in 7 hours, you're able to, at the end of those 7 hours, have your story. Now, of course, what happens is that it's more of an ongoing process where we give people assignments on a weekly basis, and we do this for 4 to 6 weeks with a group. And then other times it's in the context of an organizational retreat, for example, or a team retreat. We'll do that over increments of 2 hours or so over a couple of days, and that's the kind of thing that we sort of break up. But in general, what we've done now is that we've got 4 modules that we take people through that are roughly an hour to 2 hours each, and that sort of gets adapted to different groups.
I can imagine that people really want this to continue. This is such a
Yeah,
powerful way of, well, getting to know each other, telling your own story, feeling connected to the organization, and perhaps even having some impact in the direction that the organization is going. As you said, that there might be some modification of the mission statement, or the organization's view of itself. So I wanted to thank you just for your time. It's just a fascinating use of narrative in corporations.
mm. Yeah.
So love to hear more. And also, I wanted to alert people uh, to your podcasts
Mm.
that are really important, and narrative leadership story talks. So I started to tune in myself just to hear some of the stories as well. So we really want to alert people to listen to what you're doing on a regular basis that's accessible to everyone. So thank you so much, Jerome, for your time. It's just been a great conversation with you.
You're so welcome, and thanks for mentioning the podcast. Yeah, absolutely. That's been a great development, and great people come onto the podcast, and including people that are part of Narrative Mindworks. So yeah, really delighted to offer that. It's completely free, and wherever you can find podcasts. So yeah,
That's great. Well, thank you. Thanks again so much. Really fun talking with you. Hope we can
you're so
talk again.
welcome. Thanks for the conversation.